No, I mean.
Oh, that was a human. That was a zoom in. From above.
All right, good afternoon. We're going to get started. I know we still may have some people join us here in the room and virtually, but want to get moving this afternoon. I'm Erin Perry. I'm Deputy Director at the Cape Cod Commission, and just want to welcome you all. We appreciate you taking the time out of your day to join us for this conversation. I do want to note that the meeting is being held in a hybrid format, so we do have a number of participants on Zoom who are joining us in that format. So we do ask that those of you who are on Zoom, if you could please remain muted during the presentation portion of the meeting. We would appreciate that. During the question and answer session, you'll be able to unmute yourself and ask questions, and we'll make sure to provide an opportunity for you all to do that. And before we get into the content of the meeting, I also just want to thank the town of Barnstable for providing us with this venue, being able to host the meeting virtually, supporting a lot of the logistics and all of the technology to make this run smoothly. So thank you very much. We really appreciate the collaboration and support for the event. And so you are going to all hear from speakers today who are from the Census Equity Initiative, the Massachusetts Budget and Policy Center, and the Massachusetts Voter Table. These individuals are all engaged in a statewide effort to really be able to share information about the census, to answer questions, and to build capacity for a complete count in 2030. So we're looking forward to the presentation and look forward to your questions as well. And so Cape Cod's, I just want to maybe take a minute and provide some context for the rest of the presentation today. Cape Cod's self-response rate, and for those of you who might be unfamiliar, the self-response rate reflects how many housing units responded to the census on their own. And so Cape Cod's self-response rate actually increased in 2020 over 2010, but it still remains lower than the state and the country as a whole. We know that this is typical of highly seasonal communities, just given the number of housing units we have that are used only on a part-time basis, on a seasonal basis. So we know achieving a high self-response rate is a challenge for us as a region. But we also know that an accurate and complete count is incredibly important for the programs, projects, and services that are provided to our communities and to the work that we all do every day. So let me just make sure if we could advance to the next slide. Okay, just bear with us for a moment. We're making a few adjustments here. All right. So we know that the census count, the information that is obtained from the census, is important from a variety of perspectives. It helps us to determine public policy, funding, services provided in our communities. It informs political representation and funding allocations for infrastructure and schools, hospitals, various programs and key services and critical projects in all of our communities and elsewhere across the country. And of course, census data also informs planning. The Cape Cod Commission is the regional planning agency for Barnstable County, and we use census data consistently in the work that we do on a regional basis and then to support the 15 communities as well. So So it informs planning at the national, state, regional, and local level. And it can help shape plans for critical infrastructure projects like our roads, as well as services such as education and other services provided to residents of our 15 municipalities. So an undercount on the census can have a negative, compounding effect on our community, and it really can stretch thin the resources that people depend on every day here in our region. So that's why when Katie Campbell Simons, from the Census Equity Initiative reached out about this meeting, we were really pleased to be able to help provide a forum where we could bring stakeholders together for this conversation to learn a little bit more about the census and engage in conversation with those who are working on this statewide initiative. So with that, I am going to turn the rest of the session today over to our speakers, and we'll start with Katie Campbell Simons from the Census Equity Initiative.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here. I was actually just commenting to the folks up here that the drive down was amazing. There was so much color. It was so beautiful to see it. And I'm glad we're here on a sunny day. I feel like we've been having so much rain. I'm Katie Campbell Simons, and I'm here representing a couple different groups, actually. The National Census Equity Initiative, which is working on census issues all the time. Census is an evergreen project that we need to be working on every day, every year, not just the decennial, when the decennial comes up. And I'm also here representing the work that's happened in Massachusetts really since 2000, working with funders and partners who are engaged in conversations, education, and collaboration around the census specifically in Massachusetts, but also talking to the national partners around what we've learned about the census here in our state, what works, what doesn't work. And it's just been a real privilege. I don't know, again, I'll just give a tiny bit of history. The census really came to the attention of a lot of funders and organizations in Massachusetts right after the 2000 census, because as many of you know, when we have the census, it directly links right into the next major reevaluation of our districts and our voting districts in Massachusetts and in all states. And in 2000, there was a very unfortunate incident of gerrymandering in Massachusetts. And what happened post 2000 or 2001, when some of these districts were redone, and unfortunately our Speaker of the House was indicted on gerrymandering charges, we, as a community of funders who care about ensuring that all voices of all people and all residents in Massachusetts are heard, one particular foundation, Access Strategies Fund in Cambridge, brought a group of folks together and said, let's not see this happen again. And so that was the creation of the Massachusetts Census Equity Fund, which has been ongoing and collaboratively working on the 2010 census and the 2020 census. It's just been a real... I have seen and learned so much working with this group and deeply engaging with a lot of the grassroots organizations around the state in talking about how to inform all residents of the state as to why it's so important to answer both the decennial census and the ACS, which is the annual community survey, which is also ongoing every year and is where we get a lot of our data and information. So just wanted to share my thanks for those of you who are here and online, willing to have this conversation. It does feel like 2023. It feels like we're very far away from the census, but there is a lot already happening. So the Census Equity Initiative is a national initiative. They have given resources to my partners to the left to continue having these conversations, to continue working with partners, with funders, with cities and towns, to really continue to educate about why it's so important that we pay attention to the census, why it's so important to respond, and thinking about new strategies and new ways to inform and connect with all members of our communities. I just have a website up here, censuscounts.org, which is a national organization, a national movement that is also ongoing. They have already released the roadmap to 2030, which is a great resource. And if we do a follow-up email, we can share that with everyone. It literally goes year by year and gives pointers to community groups, municipalities, states, and even links for funders as well as to what we can be doing each year to build up to the launch of 2030. We learned a lot in 2020. There were a lot of challenges we did not expect, different challenges, and we've really learned from that. And like what was already said, there has been an increase in Barnstable County in self-response rates, which is the initial round of census, and the state of Massachusetts actually, as an entity, increased our self-response rate. So we're seeing growth, we're seeing some exciting things happen, but there's a lot more work to be done, which is why we're having these conversations. And again, we'll have questions and answers at the end, and I'm sure we can hopefully answer some of the questions folks have raised. But I'm going to turn it over next to both of my colleagues. First, Jason Wright, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at Mass Budget and Policy. And when Jason's done, we'll then turn it over to Kendra Patterson, who's the Field Director at Massachusetts Voter Table. They're going to give you a lot more info and specifics around what's been happening in Massachusetts and what we learned from 2020 and what we're thinking of going forward. So I'm going to turn it to Jason.
Hi, everyone. So again, my name is Jason Wright. I'm a Senior Policy Analyst at Mass Budget. I am, in addition to doing this, I'm the lead analyst on the budget, the state budget. So if you ever have questions about state budgeting, I hope you'll go online and look at our tools and contact me. So sorry, shameless plug for that. So this is going to be repeated, but it's probably worth repeating many, many, many times. Why are census data important? Well, I can think of at least 3 reasons. One, it helps us tell the story of our own community, right? And we'll talk more about that in a second. It helps ensure that we are represented. Kendra will be talking a lot about that, so I will not hit on that much. And it helps our communities get their fair share of resources from the federal government and from our state government. So that is critical, and I'll be talking about that later, including an example of why it matters to Cape Cod. So again, in this pretty little box, funding for critical programs tied to census data, definitely take that away with you. So again, repeating, if you're not convinced that just everybody should count, which I feel like is just on its own important, not being counted means these things. So again, we're going to repeat. We feel like this is really, really important. So let's talk about your story of Cape Cod. Now, keep in mind, any map, data table, anything is inherently incomplete. It doesn't tell the complete story of your community. I have taken, some license in picking some towns because otherwise the table would be huge and you'd be squinting a lot at the screen, and that would just not be good for your own eye health. So first, let's start with our state. I probably don't need to say this to this audience, but disparities persist in our state across geography and across all sorts of demographic variables, right? So just highlighted a few here. If you look at this is the median household income. So the median, of course, is less, it's less affected by high and extremely low values, right? So 50% above, 50% below. If you look at white, non-Latino heads of household, 97,000 about, and contrast that, just take for instance, with the black head of household, 60,000, right? Wide disparity. If you look across cities, of course, I don't think I need to tell you this because we all sort of inherently know this, I think, but just taking a look at the data gives you a little bit of extra context, right? So if you can compare Newton with Barnstable, there's quite a difference there, isn't there? And by the way, I want to mention that, again, I love the American Community Survey. I wish more people were excited about it. It's a great tool. You can go on data.census.gov, again, data.census.gov, and pull data directly from there. And the ACS is actually, it's a sample. It's happening every year. And it's actually where we get a lot of our data because, right, 10 years is a long time nowadays in between the decennial census. So a lot of the data that we pull at Mass Budget is from the American Community Survey. And I highly recommend the 5-year. Why? Bigger sample size, more reliable estimates, right? All right, Cape Cod, what you really came here for. So again, I took some license. I'm sorry, I'm not from Cape Cod. Please go easy on me. But if you look down at the bottom, we have the state, right? And then if you want to, you can compare against your neighbors. Whatever, you can do what you need to do. But we can also compare against the state. So if you look at these towns that I selected, on a number of indicators, Cape Cod is a little different than the state average or the state median. So we have median household income, again, 50% above, 50% below. We have median housing burden. What in the world does that mean? It's gross rent as a percent of household income. So, 30 is often held up as a standard. There are a lot of people who live at way above 30. We could pull that data too. And then also just a quick racial variable and poverty, right? So you can sort of see that, and actually I'm gonna go ahead and move my laptop a little bit, there we go. So Sandwich sort of sticks out, right, in this table as having a much higher median household income and a lower median housing burden. And, on average, Cape Cod is whiter than the state median, or the state average in this case, and has a little bit lower poverty in most cases, in some cases quite a bit. So, again, one of the things about this is that, these are numerical data. They don't necessarily tell stories, right? They don't necessarily get at causality, right? So one of the things that is really helpful about census data is that it can show patterns, right? So these patterns, these disparities that we see across our state, that is one of the things that quantitative data and the census data in particular are really good at, right? But the stories are policy stories and they're people stories, right? And often coupling census, like in my work, coupling census data with a story is really helpful, right? In telling that story of your community. So some of the policy, I am on the wrong thing. There we go. So actually, first, I wanted to show you some maps that I made in R. I am relearning a lot of what I know in R because it's free. So these aren't the best maps in the world, but I'm proud of them. So just to show you, you get a sense, and you'll have these, right? Get a sense of the difference across your area. So again, we have median household income and median housing burden. So one of the punchlines, again, being that it doesn't tell you the why, right? So the why for a lot of these, and there's a lot of research out there to back this up, and I encourage you to go digging. Policies at the federal, state, and local levels set up barriers that block opportunity, and they do to this day, and historical policies pay a negative dividend forward to this day, right? Like redlining. So highly encourage you to look up that if you haven't heard of it. But again, it's really important to have the census data to be able to demonstrate that there are disparities, right? And to be able to try to remedy them, right? To make the case that they need to be remedied, you need to be able to identify them. So with the census, let's talk about who gets excluded and why. The Census Bureau does some really cool analyses after the census. One of them is a demographic analysis where they get a bunch of vital statistics data from the government and they compare that to the census, right? So, all right, if you had, 100 births by birth certificate and only 80 people in your census, that's interesting. You might want to investigate that, right? So they do that, and they also do another survey after they do the census, a post-estimation survey. All of these terms are really great if you love statistics. But, both of those are essentially just they're other estimates of the population. And essentially the Census Bureau gives these to you, and you can sort of take a look at them and go, okay, well, this one says it's this, and that one says it's that, and we're probably undercounting by this much, right? And you could even potentially adjust your estimates by that, right? If you know the average undercount, then you could apply that imperfectly to your estimate. But the punchline here is, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what we just talked about, policies. Black and Latino groups, children, and renters are undercounted and sometimes significantly undercounted. Again, those estimates don't get it. Why? There are other great surveys that actually ask people, do you intend to fill out the census? And why? Do you even know about the census? And those are great because it gets at the why, right? Turns out, unsurprisingly, there's fear, there's lack of knowledge, right? 2020 census, that was an interesting one, right? Remember the citizenship question? Whew. So when you're talking to people, there was a lot of misinformation out there, right? So that's, again, the why. Well, we're demonstrating that there's an undercount so that we can get all you fine folks out there and telling everybody that the census is the greatest thing since sliced bread and you really need to answer it, right? So we've made the case to you through data, and we're hoping that you'll go out and tell the story. I also want to hold up the fact that we can make really cool data tools from the census data. And again, they provide this for free. In a world where everything is a commodity, they provide it for free. Do you know how much money Mass budget? We'd go out of business. We wouldn't be able to afford the data if it weren't free. So the great folks at Mass Voter Table, look them up. Kendra's great. They created this dashboard. It goes to the legislative district level. Oh, isn't this great? So I'm sorry, I'm a nerd. There is research out there that shows that legislators are notoriously bad at knowing the demographics of their own districts. Well, this is a great tool because then you can say, well, hey, this policy is supported by this type of person. Guess what? There's this much of that type of person in your district. You might want to go talk to them, right? So if you go on the Mass Voter Table website, you can go to this dashboard. We have conveniently, without any prior prodding from Katie, picked Moran and Sear, who are probably very familiar to you. Just to give you a sense, there's some population data. There's also some economic and voting data too, which is cool. It's pulling in another data source. So highly encourage you to check that out. All right, so the next part, remember this part that at this point, I've been talking at you a lot. I'm sorry. But another part of this, again, is the funding, the money, right? The money to do good in your community. So federal funding actually provides a lot to your people, right, in your community. We're talking housing, food, education, infrastructure. Sound important? I think so. And your fellow neighbors, you might even be using some of these services. I know I certainly do, and I have family that certainly do. So the Commonwealth shares in the cost of a number of these programs. Public finance is a fun journey to go down if you're ever interested. I'm in that every day. Yay me. So in the sharing of the cost, for instance, Mass Health in 2022, we paid about 44% of total program costs. The federal government picked up the rest of it, right? That's a lot of money that we get because they know that we have an X number of people and we need this much, and then there's a complicated formula. But what matters is that you get people out and they fill out the census so that the federal government says, oh, there are more people, you need more money. 353 federal programs use census data in determining how money is distributed to states and localities. That was $2.8 trillion nationwide in fiscal year 2021. That's a lot of money. So, what does that matter for you? Well, I just pulled a couple of handy facts from our State Department of Transitional Assistance. SNAP, used to be known as food stamps, and TANF are both programs administered by them. And both of those programs get money. The money for that is allocated partly by census data, right, using census data. So for almost 15,000 of your fellow Cape Codders are using SNAP because they can't afford to buy food, right? And there are many more because SNAP doesn't serve everyone who needs food, right? So the more people you get out there and fill out the census, the more the federal government will understand that we have great need in our communities. So I want to turn it over to Kendra at Mass Voter Table.
Greetings, everyone. Does this sound all right? All right, good afternoon. I am Kendra Patterson, Field Director with the Massachusetts Voter Table, and I'm here to share a little bit about what this work looks like in community on the ground. And so we're going to be reviewing equity for 2023, what a statewide infrastructure for year-round civic engagement looks like in building a complete count in 2030. So just a little bit about the Massachusetts Voter Table and the work that we do. We're completely focused on gaining civic access and engagement across the state. And so we work predominantly in BIPOC and low-income communities with hope to achieve a multiracial democracy. And so we do this in a lot of different ways, one of the which that we're just going to be focusing on today, of course, is the census. So why should everyone work on the ground towards a complete count? We love to use this this little chart here to show how resources flow. There's a step one is getting our community engaged, having them participate, whether it's in the census or what we're in the midst of right now, which is municipal elections, right? And then to two, for us to be able to move those resources. Jason talked a lot about what it looks like to have the count for federal funds to move into community. And so that is that part there, moving our resources and to also get our representation. And so that's the last and third part, because we do use census data to draw our districts. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about our process in redistricting across the state of Massachusetts as well. And in the middle, of course, is power, because we want to make sure that our people on the ground and community have the power and resources that they need to achieve the life that they deserve. Okay, we're going to do a little bit of analysis of census compared to voter turnout. This is also something that you can find in our lovely dashboard that Jason presented. We like to compare the two because it is telling in certain communities who participates in either or both, right? The census and upcoming elections. And so in this first linear graph, I guess you can say this is, we're looking at two things. We're looking at who is people of color within municipalities. So on the bottom, you'll see the percentage, 5% to 25% of people of color within different cities. And then you'll also see on the top is their response rate. So we have both the census self-response and who participated in the 2020 election, which I'm sure we all remember, right? And so with that, in the orange dot, what you can pull from this graph is you can see that the more people of color within a city, they had less participation in comparison to their white counterparts. And so you'll see the cluster of dots on the left-hand side are closer and higher in participation for both. So it just shows the disparity and work that we need to do to make sure that folks that have historically been left out of the conversations or undercounted, right, are now informed, and we're going out in communities and having those conversations for them to participate in both. This is another example, but specifically for income. So you'll see also on the bottom, it gives the range of income per household, and also it tells you, based on this information, the higher the income, oh, there's a lot of activity outside. The higher the income, the more aligned they are in participating in both. And so the further that you see on the left-hand side, the dots are a little bit further from each other. They're below the line and some are above, but it just shows the work that we need to do in community to consistently be engaged and participate in both the election and the census. So, how did we work on the ground to get out the count in 2020? The first thing is the Massachusetts Voter Table started early. We started in 2017, talking to organizations on the ground, identifying trusted leaders, and forming alliances with government groups, with CEI, and identifying elected officials that can advocate in their communities to push and inform residents of the census. And a major piece of that is identifying trusted messengers. We always lead with this at the Massachusetts voter table because a trusted messenger is a neighbor. It's a person that's in the community that when you're having a conversation with them, you can identify maybe similar things that you've noticed in your community's issues or share information. And so we think this is the most honest conversation that you can have in communities, knocking on a neighbor's door, and instead of asking for sugar, ask for what their participation is like in the upcoming election and what issues matter the most to their friends and family. And so we did this work earlier on, bringing new people and organizers into the fold and sharing information about why the census is important to really propel the work that we started doing on the ground in 2020. Going to networks, we had a strong network of partners, state, local, and national on the federal level. Here is the few. And so this is also the weaving of all of those entities and saying, hey, we need to make sure that the census is getting out in the communities. Who are our partners on the ground, and what resources can we make sure that we're getting education in our community for folks to participate? And so this is a huge piece from philanthropic organizations, nonprofit organizations, and different government organizations as well, all coming together to make sure that the count was on the ground. And I talked a little bit about this. You can probably tell that I'm very passionate about door knocking. Just because we live in a society that has been desocialized because we've been in isolation for 2020 and, growing society. But we're meeting people where they are. And that this is very important in the conversation because there are a lot of different modes where people communicate these days, right? You can think of social media, or maybe you had a call with your mother or your family member earlier, right? Or talk to a neighbor. But it's really important to identify where the people that we need to be counted in community are, right? Which is everyone, because everyone counts. But we want to make sure that we're meeting them in their safest space in the most comfortable way as well, and sharing information. And so with that, we want to go into some challenges that we saw within the 2020 count, and also some solutions from the work that we have done and that we continue to do with the voter table at the Democracy Hubs as well. One of the major challenges, which was teased by Jason, was also the SCOTUS decision, right? There was a lot of uncertainty in 2020. It was a historic year, right? We had a pandemic. We had uncertainty with the SCOTUS case on whether we were going to have the citizenship question, right? And there was a lot of fear and participation. And what we did on the ground at the Massachusetts voter table is work with other entities like the Legal Center of Rights, some different groups, lawyer groups, to help us make a case as to why this is threatening to certain communities. One of the things that they found in doing that case is researchers saw there was already a massive undercount by Latino groups by 8 people per household, depending on the areas. But with that, we saw that from 2020, how that would be a threat to discourage people and digress participation in 2020. And so with that, we were able to shift away from it and win the case, which is a win, right? But it also just shows that there's constant threats to really ensuring that everyone is counted and feels comfortable in participating in the census, which affects everybody's daily life. One thing that I did want to pull into this is really how we had a shift in 2020. I know I'm talking about a lot of door knocking, which I'm happy that we're back to now, but we were in a state of emergency of March 10th, 2020, right? Meaning that enumerators, folks that usually were on the ground, and our partners on the ground knocking doors were pulled from the field for health safety reasons. And so we had to think of other ways that we can connect with folks. we did a lot of phone banking to share the different self-response ways that households can participate in the census. And this is really grabbing from the self-response of online, by mail, or by phone. And you'll see here, though it has raised since 2010 for both the state and Barnstable County, but Barnstable County still falls about 20% below the state average. And so these are things that we can see and think about and ponder on in community. And I'm going to talk about what are some ways that you, as a member or a part of different organizations, can start thinking about how we're incorporating and educating community from now until 2030. We spoke about some challenges, heavy stuff, but let's get into some solutions. One solution is continuing outreach. Some of our organizations that completely focused on civic engagement, which is the outreach of talking to folks in community, turned into service-based organizations. They saw the need in community in 2020. And so they connected census information with what needs that they needed from their COVID status, right? Whether they were food insecure or needed access to specific housing vouchers or whatever the case may be. Our groups really stood up and really said, hey, this is what our community needs. They need to be counted, and they need to make it through this pandemic because it's very uncertain. And so we were on the ground having real conversations with people on the phones and meeting people where they are to give them PPE or whatever materials that they needed. And so that was a major part, and being flexible in 2020. What that looks like in 2023 is remaining that flexibility and learning from what happened in 2020 so we can be prepared and shifting. And that means strengthening our civic engagement infrastructure. On the first slide, I talked a little bit about year-round civic engagement. And this is something that we're even pushing internally within our groups because we can become so hyper-focused on other major things like elections, right? But really thinking about how are we preparing our leaders, which are our leaders in our organizations, and the community by pairing both and having a more fuller conversation on what their status of life is and giving that information. And so one way that we can strengthen and get towards a complete count is making sure that we're building out our civic engagement infrastructure. I do want to take the time and highlight with the Massachusetts Voter Table, we have a great program called the Democracy Hubs, which now has around 35 organizations across the state that were really just focused on building long-term power. What does that look like in their communities? And we saw this need in 2020 when we said, hey, we need to become more local. We need to become more regional focused. And we built out different regional tables across Massachusetts. We're up to 7 now. And we're right now within one of our gap areas. Would love to talk to folks if you're interested in the work that we do following this. As we know, the CAPE is really essential in making sure that has a full count. But we wanted to share the work that the Democracy Hubs groups are doing, all the work that I referred to before about knocking doors, about meeting people where they are. Different organizations within the Democracy Hubs carried out that group. And in 2020, we had over 300,000 calls that we made to make sure that we were reaching people and sharing this important information. And with that, we're continuing to do this work. We have several trainings across the state where we're informing our new leaders, our new organizers about the census and how this really affects the work that we're working towards in the greater picture. And so that's a huge part, is making sure that we're training our community members on the information. Now, one major thing that we did work on and is influenced by census data is redistricting. And why redistricting is specifically important to the Massachusetts Voter Table is because we want to make sure that the leaders that we're developing, the leaders in color that are predominantly in people of color cities and neighborhoods, actually have the option of running and winning where they're from. And that's really important based on the census data. And so we want to make sure that we're maximizing, this is that third piece, increase representation on the ground and who we have in our offices to advocate for us. And so we have some fun pie graphs. Everyone loves a good pie chart. You'll see here is in 2020, when we were collecting the census data, right? I'm sure you can see overwhelmingly who were the candidates, who pulled papers to run for office in 2020. Over 80% of them were white folks. Is that representative of our full Massachusetts? No, and we found that with the redistricting numbers. And so with that, we did worked and led the table with doing redistricting in 2021. And from 2022, look how much more, it's much colorful. Wow, we have blue. And we saw that over 40% of the candidates were Black. We saw that evened out with 22%. Middle Eastern wasn't even on the chart before. We have Latine or Latino, and then we also have Afro-Latino. And so we want to make sure that we're seeing a full scope of what our communities look like. And that's why representation is very important, but it starts with participation in the census. And I will wrap just with some lessons for growth, making sure that we fund census work early and often, and we're not just starting to have these conversations in 2029, right? We're having them now, and we're convening more. We're investing specifically in year-round civic engagement and community engagement. Thank you for providing this forum for us to get together, and this is a great way to see who's in the room, who's also interested, and what are some ways, because you are experts of your community. We're just providing you with the data, right? To also give you things that you may already know, but you're the experts of your communities. What are some ways that you can all convene and think about what your organizations bring or you bring as an individual to contribute to getting a better count out and doing education in community? And that's a large part of creating, but also holding the pillars of infrastructure, structures, funders, census groups, grassroots organizations, right? Everyone counts, so no one's left out. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about that earlier on and using this as a launching space for more opportunity.
Thank you so much. Thanks to both of you. I just want to say a couple things before we open it up to questions. Just these PowerPoints will be shared. I know there's a lot of good data that folks will probably want to look at, and several of the resources that we've mentioned we can also share out as well. But one of the things I wanted to say is that the work around census and the annual community survey and redistricting, they're all an integral part of ensuring that our democracy works. And we have built this country and this state and our communities at the local level on a democratic system. And working on census, year round and in an evergreen way, it's really taught me and some of our other funders that I've worked with that this is not necessarily a political issue. This is a democratic issue. And this is ensuring that everyone's voice is heard and everyone has a chance to vote and everyone has a chance to be represented, no matter where you're from, no matter your walk of life. And we know that there are challenges. We talked today a little bit about some of the hardest to count, right? And we learned so much in 2020, even more so. And I just wanted to mention that the work that's happening nationally now is really addressing some of those large gaping holes in some of these, in some of the questions. So right now, some of these national partners and the Census Equity Initiative are tracking work being done on the race question and the gender question. Like those are that was heard very loud and clear by the Census Bureau. We have a wonderful census leader right now in Robert Santos, and who is a data guy. So it's wonderful to have someone who understands the ins and outs of the data. And they're really addressing some of those issues, right? That, there's challenges in reaching folks, and then there's challenges in, when you get that piece of paper or you get that email, there may or may not be always every little option that you feel that you need to express in identifying who you are. And so the Census Bureau is really working on that right now, which is really great. And there's a lot of national groups that are tracking it very closely and advocating for changes back and forth with the Census Bureau. And then the other piece I just wanted to mention is that many of the challenges that were mentioned and opportunities for outreach and engagement are also being looked at. There's the Census Equity Initiative, which I'm here representing today. They are building the Get Out the Count plan for 2030, and we are doing that in partnership with pretty much every national organization you can think of that's working with BIPOC communities across the country. So the National Urban League, Asian American Resource Workshop. I'm going to not be able to list them all. The Native Americans for Justice. There's a national LGBTQ group at the table. There's a national Latino organization. The Leadership Conference. So really trying to dig deep into where those challenges are around reaching the hardest to count folks and ensuring the safety of their data when that information comes in the door to the Census Bureau and how they track that information. So just wanted to say those things, and I know we're going to open it up to Q&A.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Katie, Jason, and Kendra. We really appreciate you being here and sharing some of this information. With that, we will open it up for questions, and I'll ask some of my colleagues at the commission to monitor if there are questions online, but why don't we start if there are any questions here in the room first. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
I think if for folks to hear you online, you have to come up to the,
Thank
the
you.
microphone.
Too many microphones. This week, we've had problems everywhere. Hi, Elizabeth Harder. Wondering how long, as I recall, in 2020, there was a problem on the Cape with when the census could be counted because we have so many second homeowners, people who winter in Florida and aren't here. So I'm wondering if you know already the schedule for the 2030 count. Thank you.
Either of you have it? So I don't think we know it'll be April 1st will be the launch, 2030. But the first step will be LUCA, which is in 2027, but we will start talking to the state and municipalities probably 2025. And I always forget, it stands for the Local Update of Census Addresses. And that's where the state works with municipalities, and UMass Boston has the Donahue Institute. They work very closely with the state of Massachusetts, and they track all primary residence addresses and update them. So yes, the Cape and the Berkshires have a very specific challenge around second homes, and the challenge is ensuring that people only get counted once and are counted in their primary residence. And so that is a challenge, something specific to the Cape. And I will say also that when we were doing the Mass Census Equity Fund work, we also had a hard time connecting with local partners on the Cape to support some of this outreach and conversation. So like Kendra said, around the hub work, we really welcome ideas on local organizations and groups who can be having these conversations around census, around the specific challenges to the Cape. I also know that you have what people have referred to as sort of hidden poverty, where you have, like, for instance, Sandwich, right? You've got this higher income average, but literally street by street, you have folks who are in poverty, and how do we reach those folks, and how do we make them and help them feel comfortable coming forward and being counted? So we would love to do more regional work and partnership with the Cape and Islands on those issues. But yes, Luca is the first step to that in ensuring that those primary addresses are updated and clarified, and there will be some outreach that happens, and so it'd be great to know. We'll start with the commission, but go from there as to who to connect the Donahue Institute to.
Great, thank you very much. Sure, we'll take one question here, and then in the back, if you could step to the microphone. And then just a quick note for those who are participating virtually, if you could just raise your hand if you have a question. After we get through these two, I'll switch over to virtual participants.
Okay. So I am immigrant here on the Cape. I've been here for the past 25 years. I would like to know, how was your approach in 2020 to reach the diverse community here on the Cape with multiple languages and limited English barriers? I was contacted in 2020 to help spread the word, but as you have pointed out, with the tricky questions in a political climate that happens every 4 years, and also municipal elections and all of that, depending who's running, the immigrants will hide. And that goes within the BIPOC community too, with all the attacks that has been happening in the last 4 years, have been more vibrant because of the isolation in the pandemic, but it has been happening. So how have you been approaching to get that data?
Kendra, do you want to answer that?
I can't answer it in full because unfortunately this work predates me. But one thing I can say, in other communities, we didn't have an organization here down on the Cape, right? And so it was fully to the national organization to see who was going to be reaching out to folks. But what we do in the instances where it's multiple folks on the ground is we identify who speaks different languages. And so that's where the trusted messenger comes in, because if someone's knocking on your door that looks like you're more likely, in speaking your language, you're more likely to have an in-depth conversation with them. And so that is something that we always keep in mind with even the work that we do right now on the ground, and making sure that folks know that it's a comfortable conversation and they can trust you in having and entering that conversation.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'll say too that the Mass Census Equity Initiative, we did fund the Brazilian Immigrant Center, which is up in Boston, but they had a satellite office here in Hyannis. So we had given them some support to do outreach and community education around, because not only did we have just the current, the sort of expected challenges with the census. We had the fear of the citizenship question. We had the threat of the previous administration. And like you said, the increase of isolation and ICE.
ICE, yes.
So there was
Immigration, yes.
yeah. So what our goal is, and I know in talking with other states too, is to support community groups that are there, geographically located in your community, who can talk to people. So like Kedra said, trusted messengers who speak their language. The Census Bureau does produce material in over 100 languages, and as well as in Braille and I'm forgetting. Anyway, so in Massachusetts itself, also our Complete Count Committee was chaired by Mira, and so they tried really hard to produce multiple pieces of information and education in multiple languages, but it's still challenging. It's challenging to connect at the community level if you don't have community organizations that you can support. So that, again, would be a very clear request from some of the state partners and even some of the national partners I've been working with, is who are the folks on the ground that are trusted messengers that we can share, we can listen to, hear what kind of information is needed so that we can support it being produced and shared. So that's sort of that's what we're doing now, is having these conversations, starting to think about where are there places that we need to produce new materials, what kinds of materials. We've even talked about creating materials that don't have a lot of words, that they're visual, more helping people understand the process. So it doesn't necessarily have to even be translated.
So that goes to a comment. So you mentioned about training trusted leaders. How are you recruiting them? Are they volunteers, or are you giving incentive for them, like a paid training so they can go out in the community, help you out on filling out the census? And when you're mentioned, I say for the work that I have been doing for several years, what I have noticed in my community, on top of limited English speakers, there is a big population here on the Cape that are immigrants that are illiterate in their first language. So giving them a huge lot of page census in gibberish language, they're not going to fill it out.
Yeah.
So are you training people to sit down with them and translate that in a 4th grade level literacy?
These are great questions. And so one of the pieces why we created the democracy hubs, because we also realized there was a need to pull our money together and pay people, because it's not sustainable to do year-round civic engagement on volunteers. Just having volunteers, right? And recognizing that folks that are BIPOC and low income do not have those same liberties of time. Right? And so if they need to be paid for their time to contribute back to the community, so that's a large piece of what we do, is when we're working with our organization. So that's the answer to the first question. We identify leaders in community through the organizations that we support within that community. And so we ask them, what are your mechanisms? Who do you already have folded in? Is there some specific outreach and recruitment that you can be doing at high schools, at a local community college? And what are some entryways that they can come in that's not intimidating, right? Can they come to an event? Can they come to our interview for their job if there's a position up? So all of the positions that we encourage our partners to have are paid. And with that, we have regional trainings that we do constantly. We honestly have too many trainings. But with that, we walk through with them. Depending on what it is, if it's specifically the census or walking over the census, what the different areas are and what are the best ways to explain it to people, to walk through it with them on the doors. So we're not just knocking on doors or having conversations on the phone without walking them through it in real time, if the time allows, or providing them with an additional resource. Now, what you're saying about at the 4th grade level, I think that's something we should consider. I don't think that's a specific conversation that we've had when we've talked to folks on the grounds, but we do trust the folks in those communities to come talk and have conversations with their counterparts and really say, you're the expert on knowing how to talk to your community, and so we're providing you with the tools. But I think that's a conversation that we should consider.
Because it's the reality.
Yeah.
It's the reality.
Definitely.
Because it's not just limited English speakers.
It's low
like
literacy.
Illiteracy in general for their first language. And there's the immigration way has changed. There's a lot of immigrants that are coming in that are well-educated and are intellectual, but we have a big portion that are uneducated in their own language, a very limited spoken in their first language. So these surveys, it's even if you translate in 100 different languages, it
Right.
can be a challenge in their own first language the way it is written.
So one of the other things we are encouraging the Census Bureau to do is to hire enumerators. Those are the folks that go door to door, folks that are already in the community, that are already known, folks that are trusted messengers, folks that speak the language. But then also a big piece, I quickly mentioned it before, was low literacy information. So someone who can sit down with someone and explain the process, explain it, but not necessarily reading through a document, maybe showing more of a visual aid of how this just came up in a national meeting I was in Baltimore over the summer, is that we have to create low literacy outreach, not only as independent organizations, but the Census Bureau needs to do it as well. And as we're building this plan for 2030, we're really trying to do as much as we can nationally, collaboratively, so that can then filter to the states. And the Massachusetts Voter Table is the Massachusetts arm of a national group called State Voices, who are also at the table around this planning for census. So we're just trying to work on I'm sharing this recording with our national partners. They will hear what you're saying today because we know it's a problem. So I'm literally going to forward through and go listen to 25 minutes in because it's really important for everybody to hear this because it's a challenge. But it did come up. 2 different groups mentioned it at our national meeting that we need low literacy. We've talked about translation, but the other key piece is really getting the Census Bureau to be thinking smartly about how they hire enumerators. And in 2020, we had half the budget that we normally have for enumerators. In Massachusetts, there used to be an office here on the Cape, and there wasn't even during 2020, which also reduced the outreach efforts. But I hear you, and I'm hearing it nationally too. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Excuse me, one more question here in the room, and then I'll look to the virtual attendees. Thank you.
I want to thank you for this moment here. It's really important. And I just reaffirm what she asked. I am also an immigrant. I'm a Brazilian. I am here living on the Cape for about 20 years. We do have now our organization here called Latinx in Action. And our intention is we really want our community to be involved, to be part of this. We do have ESL classes. Would love to have maybe, be an opportunity to have those questions and everything comes to our classes. And yes, one other thing that I was really bothering me and getting me mad because when you say who you are, so you put there Hispanic. I'm not Hispanic. I am Latino, and that just like it can be like a barrier. There's some questions that really is can be a barrier. People don't want to go forward. So I'm glad that you're looking for that. It's just like echoing the voice that please be sensitive to things like, about who I am and who I am. So it's just like saying that we have here in Cape Cod now organizations that are representing our communities. Okay,
That's great. And I think what Jason was referring to too, that also that ends up being not, when you can't clearly define who you are, then the data's wrong, right? And they don't. Do you mind if I? Yeah, sure.
So this question of how we ask questions is exceptionally important, right? Like not just for respecting people and respecting communities, but also for the data too. Like both things are true, right? So if you ask better questions, you get better data. If you ask better questions, you respect the community, right? So it'll be interesting to see what the Census Bureau does. I'm glad you mentioned that they're working on those questions around race, ethnicity, et cetera. One of the things that is also great is that the Census Bureau gives micro data. So like it's I'm trying to think of the best way to explain it. It's like this somewhat protected version of individual responses. It doesn't actually name you, right? But it's like it's de-identified. And the great thing about that is that there are weights, and I can say like, okay, well, I can see that this person, I don't know who they are, right? Checked that they, they were born in this country and they identify as this, not necessarily Hispanic, but they identify as this and this and this. And I can actually then tabulate, right? As a data analyst, I can tabulate that in a different way than the census offers it, right? And so the more options that they give people in their questions, there'll be even more flexibility in the ability to do that, right? Now, I get that you do have to know an analyst or learn it yourself, but it does mean that there's flexibility. And again, it's flexibility for free, right? So I just want to note that there is flexibility in recalculating tables that don't just conform to what the federal government thinks is race and ethnicity, right? Which hasn't changed in a while. So sorry, I hope that was helpful.
Thank you. All right, we're going to go to our virtual attendees for some questions. Happy to come back to any other questions we have in the room too. I believe we have Ryan with his hand up. Ryan Curley, please go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, so we had a census worker in the town I am who's also on our planning board. While the census was underway, they made multiple comments about the illegal housing that that she was finding people were living in, and wanted basically the town to start enforcing different sections of the zoning bylaws. Commonly, these were unofficial ADUs, and there's nowhere for these people to go, and they're scared that they will lose their housing, and they hide. So you're not going to get a good response from them, or even like if they go to the property owners, they're not going to report that they have an ADU on the property if it's unofficial, because they're scared about enforcement. But in that case specifically, there needs to be a more concerted effort to screen potential workers, because you do not want somebody in a policymaking position coming in and using their experience in collecting data to the detriment of potential respondents. So that's it for me.
Yeah, I mean, there's the role of the Census Bureau, and then there's the role of the community, trying to support their work. So I understand exactly what you're saying, and that trust issue is really challenging, and it's why we are lucky in Massachusetts in that our complete count committee, the governor's office, our funding community, our mass counts community, and our local census director, we met monthly. And we were able to talk about some of these challenges and share these ideas and share these concerns. That doesn't happen everywhere. But we were able to specifically talk about issues in New Bedford, Fall River, north of Boston and Chelsea, where we wanted to ensure that people felt safe. There had just, we had several ICE raids just recently before 2020. And so I understand exactly what you mean. But there are some limitations in how engaged we can be on the Census Bureau's hiring. But again, in Massachusetts, we do have some pretty great relationships already with the Census Bureau that we can talk to them about. But also, Director Santos is listening, and they do have a lot of open webinars and conversations where they ask for input. And again, I could share, along with the follow-up email, how to log on and receive the census updates. I literally get an email from them daily with different things that are happening, different reports they're releasing. But they have a lot of open conversations, so they're willing to listen, which not every federal government group is. So I feel kind of lucky in that. But thank you for raising that. It's a good point.
Great, thank you. Can I just ask one more time if there are any other questions from our virtual participants? All right. Someone will let me know if there are. I can't see you at the moment, but if there are no more questions at the moment virtually, I'll go back to the room for a moment and just see if anybody else has any follow-up questions before we wrap it up today. Sure.
Hello. I don't have a question, but I did want to give some information. I'm Karen Ann Procaccini. I'm from the Cape and Islands Community Action Program. And so we just finished our community needs assessment. And there's a large part of the document that has the Census and the American Community Survey information in it that is describing Barnstable County, Nantucket, and Dukes County. Besides the needs assessments and the poverty data, there's also a section on what is happening in the community. Policies in Massachusetts that are supportive or not supportive of issues that arise in our community. So it is a large document. It will be going up on our website in the next couple of weeks. There is a document up there that was done 3 years ago, because as a community action program, we're mandated to do these every 3 years. So we gather that data, and then the other part that's in there is on the top needs. We also provide the strengths in our community. So what services are there? So it is a really wonderful tool if you're doing any data gathering for anything, grant writing or whatever. And it does filter into our community data that is out there on the larger databases. So I'm hoping that would be helpful. Our website is www.cacci.cc. And thank you for the opportunity to let the community know. And thank you for being here and doing this today. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, seeing no last questions, I think we'll wrap it up. If you don't mind just passing me the clicker for a quick moment. Just as we wrap up, I wanted to share some resources that some of you may be familiar with, but the resources that we provide at the Cape Cod Commission. If somebody could advance the slide for me, I'm having some trouble, sorry. The resources we provide at the Commission to make data, like census data, but a lot of other data as well, more readily available and accessible to communities. And so Data Cape Cod is a website that you all have access to now. It's datacapecod.org, and I'll share the web address toward the end of the slides. But it provides information on the people, places, and economy of our region. It shares information like the census data on population and a number of the other kind of data points and information that come from the census. You can also view town-by-town profiles, and these profiles pull directly the American Community Survey data, and you can look at information related to demographics and housing, workforce, and industry. So this is just a quick snapshot of the data that we have here on Data Cape Cod, but we did want to make sure that you're aware of that resource, and we'll continue to update this. We continue to expand Data Cape Cod to include additional data dashboards and information that are helpful, that we think are helpful anyway to communities, or that we hear from individuals like yourselves that could be helpful in your work. So this is a resource that will continue to update and is available to you all. So I want to leave you with that, as well as with Katie, Jason, and Kendra's contact information. We want to thank them very much for being here today. And I'm sure that they would all be open to questions if you think of things after this meeting and would like to reach out. So their information is there as well. So thank you all, and look forward to talking with you more as we get a little bit closer to 2030. All right.
Thank Thank you all.
Thank you.